So tons and tons of people are given interviews to get into medical school, but only so many of them actually end up making it into the course. So in this video, I'll share with you guys 8 mistakes that I think inexperienced interviewees make in their interviews that you can avoid to not tank your chances of getting into medical school. Hey everyone, if you're new here, my name is Emil and I'm a first year medical student studying at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And before I get into the first mistake that I think people make in their interviews, make sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you appreciate the content. Now, the first mistake that I think a lot of inexperienced interviewees make in their interviews is having a weak start and finish. Now, the start and finish of your interview are so important because of something called the serial position effect. And what this is the idea that people will remember the start and the end of something way better than they'll actually remember the middle of it. And this definitely applies to your interviewers because they'll be interviewing lots of people on the same day, and as a result, they'll get tired and they'll start to forget things that you say in the middle of your answer. What I see a lot of inexperienced interviewers do is that they start off the answer kind of weak and hesitant, and then they get into their stride of things, and then they give a strong middle of the answer. But that doesn't actually matter because it's more likely that the interviewer will actually remember the start of your answer. As a solution to this, make sure that you start your interview with a really strong sentence that signals to the examiner that you know what you're talking about, and also make sure to end on a definitive note when you finish your answer. Keep in mind also that this doesn't have to apply to just a question in the scenario. Make sure that the start and finish of your whole interview is also good as well. The second mistake that I think beginner interviewees tend to make is forgetting to signpost and signal in their answers. Now, I remember when I was doing the interview last year, I didn't actually know whether you were supposed to signpost your answers or whether you were supposed to give a brief introduction. However, now that I've actually done my interviews, I kind of get the idea that it is better to signpost at the start of your answers. The reason I say this is if you don't signpost, sometimes the interviewer is left in the dark and wondering about what you're actually going to talk about, and they might start to wonder if you're just going to keep rambling on and on. But if you give at the start of your answer a little signal to the interviewer that you're going to talk about 2 things on the pros side and 2 things on the con side, they know what they're looking for, and they'll also make sure to write down what you're actually talking about as well. As a quick word of warning about this though, make sure you don't go overboard. I don't think your introduction needs to be any longer than about 15 seconds because otherwise you run the risk of running out of time or just repeating yourself later on. This leads me on to the third mistake that I think a lot of beginner interviewers make, which is repeating themselves. Repeating yourself is something that a lot of people do when they get under stressed or they get a bit nervous and they're not really sure what they're talking about, so they end up defaulting to the thing they've said before because they know that's right. However, repeating yourself in an interview can be bad for several reasons. Firstly, it can make it seem like you're actually trying to waste time in the interview and that you don't actually know what you're talking about. Secondly, it can also take away from the clarity of your previous answer. For example, if you were an interviewer and you heard someone talking about advocating for disabled people at the start of the interview, and then 30 seconds later they start talking about it again, then they might start to wonder what they were actually talking about in the first part of the interview. Hopefully from that quick example, you can see how repeating yourself can actually take away from clarity in your interview answers. The other thing that's just bad about repeating yourself is that it wastes time, and in the MMIs and in your interviews, you want to be telling the examiners as much as you can about yourself and giving as much depth into the answers as you possibly can. So repeating yourself can possibly take time away from another better point that you could actually bring up. So the next fatal mistake in any interview is not addressing or acknowledging the patient's concerns. So often in scenarios or in interviews, you'll be given situations where a patient has just been diagnosed with something horrible or they're going through something awful in their life. And in these scenarios, it's so important that you always acknowledge the way the patient is feeling. And that's something that a lot of people actually forget to do. Because the question is often, what would you do next? Sometimes people get too excited and they jump straight into giving the answer to a scenario or trying to provide a solution to the situation. But it's always important to remember to just put in a line at the start, for example, saying, "Hey, I understand how you're feeling. That is totally okay." Before I get into the 5th mistake that beginner interviewers make sure to drop a like on the video or subscribe to the channel for more interview related content. So the next thing that sets people back quite a lot in their interviews is actually speaking with a stony face and having a really monotonous voice. So I know this can be really hard for a lot of people because when we get nervous, it's often really easy for us to sort of shrink into ourselves and to speak with a quieter voice. However, it's really important to remember that the interview is almost like a conversation, and as a result, you need to keep the examiner actually entertained and intrigued in what you're saying. There is a huge difference between talking in a really monotonous voice like this and actually putting a lot of emotion and care into the things that you're talking about. Also remember that this is medicine, and people in medicine are required to be really passionate and caring about the things that they're talking about. So the more emotion, the more passion you can show in your interview, the better off you'll actually be. For some practical advice on how you can appear more engaged and passionate in your interview, the first thing that can help a lot is just speaking through a smile, and also try a lot to modulate the tone of your voice while speaking in sentences. So the next mistake that inexperienced interviewees make in their interviews is forgetting parts of the scenario that are actually important to answering the question. You have to remember in your MMIs that the scenarios are written by the university, and most parts of the scenario are purposely included in there. It's sort of like a poem in English where you could theoretically analyze every line, but the important thing is just to make sure that you use parts of the scenario in your answer. For example, if the scenario mentioned that the person has kids and has just been diagnosed with a chronic condition, make sure you bring in the kids into your answer, because the person will undoubtedly be worried about who will be taking care for their kids, who will deal with their parental duties, and possibly even what will happen to their partner and what responsibilities their partner might have to take up. So it's really important that you bring in these details, because that's what the interviewers are actually looking for, and it's what a lot of people actually forget to do. So the next mistake that a lot of inexperienced interviewees make is forgetting to pick a side at the end of the day. So in a lot of scenarios, you'll be given situations where there is just no right answer, but even in these scenarios, it's really important that at the end of the day, you pick a side. What's important here is not that you pick a side and you start to argue for it, but more that you consider both sides of the equation, and from weighing them up that you actually choose a side. The mistakes that people fall into in this category is either just choosing not to pick a side at all, or picking a side and just arguing for that side at all extents and just ignoring the valid points that are available on the other side. If you're asked to make a decision, just make sure that you're doing it by considering both sides and making a carefully thought out and balanced decision. The last thing that everyone needs to watch out for in their interviews is failing to manage their time properly. Now, the interviews are often actually quite time pressured, because there's so much that you can possibly talk about and reveal about yourself or about your own qualities or about the scenario that you can actually run out of time really easily. People can get caught up in the scenario and then start rambling on and on about something, and as a result, they can either get cut off or they just run out of time to answer the other questions in the scenario. In both of those cases, you end up actually losing marks and losing out on time to reveal things about yourself or about other answers in the scenario, and it just ends up setting you back quite a lot. The best answer to any interview question will be concise and detailed, but also delivered in a time that allows the interviewer to ask any follow-up questions, and also to get through all of the questions they've been required to ask in a scenario. That wraps up this video about 8 things that you should avoid in your interviews. Make sure to subscribe or like the video, and check out this playlist for all of your interview needs.